overshadowed and ignored all my life, until I turned the tables on my golden child sister and took my revenge. Growing up, I never really felt like I was part of my own family. My parents, Linda and Tom, had 2 daughters, my sister Brittany and me, Allison, but you'd never know it by the way they treated us. Brittany was their golden child, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong, while I was just there. If you asked my parents, they'd probably tell you I was the difficult one, the troublemaker. But the truth? The truth is, I spent my entire childhood trying to be noticed, trying to be loved as much as Brittany, and failing miserably. From as early as I can remember, everything revolved around Brittany. If she wanted something, she got it. If she threw a tantrum, they caved immediately. And if she ever accused me of anything, even the most ridiculous lies, my parents didn't ask questions. They believed her, every single time. If she cried and pointed at me, I was punished. It didn't matter if I hadn't done anything. It didn't matter if I had proof that I wasn't even in the room when whatever she was whining about happened. I was always the one in trouble. One of the worst parts was that my parents never needed evidence to punish me. If Brittany came running to them in tears, screaming, "Allison took my toy," or "Allison ruined my homework," they'd storm into my room, rip through my things, and either take something away from me or ground me on the spot. And if I dared to defend myself, if I so much as said, "That's not true," or "I didn't do anything," I was met with, "Don't talk back," or "You should have thought about that before you upset your sister." It wasn't just punishments, either. Even on days that were supposed to be special for me, like my birthday, Brittany came first. Every single birthday of mine, the cake was picked out based on her favorite flavor, not mine. I remember being a kid, maybe 6 or 7, and excitedly telling my mom I wanted a chocolate cake with strawberries. I mean, I was so excited. I even drew a little picture of it because I wanted it to be perfect. But when my birthday came, there was no chocolate, no strawberries. Instead, there was a vanilla cake with rainbow sprinkles, Brittany's favorite. And when I asked why, my mom rolled her eyes and said, "You know Brittany doesn't like chocolate. Stop being selfish." That was the first year I stopped getting excited about my birthday. Because why bother? It wasn't for me. Brittany got everything. Expensive gifts, new clothes, vacations. She had this beautiful pink and white bedroom with a matching vanity, a walk-in closet filled with brand-name clothes, and shelves lined with dolls and stuffed animals. I, on the other hand, had a tiny room with mismatched furniture that mostly consisted of hand-me-downs from Brittany. I can't count the number of times my parents bought something nice for Brittany and, a few months later, handed it down to me like it was some great privilege to receive her leftovers. The most painful part? The vacations. My parents took Brittany on trips all the time. Disney World, cruises, beach resorts, she got to experience it all. Meanwhile, I was left behind. I remember being about 10 when I finally built up the courage to ask my mom why I never got to go. She sighed, like she was tired of explaining something obvious, and said, "Because Brittany enjoys traveling more than you do." That was it. No other explanation. As if they'd ever given me the chance to figure out if I liked traveling in the first place. It wasn't just that they left me out, it was the way they didn't even try to hide it. I'd watch them pack their suitcases, giggling and excited, while I sat in the background, silent, pretending I didn't care. Then they dropped me off at my Aunt Carol's house with barely a goodbye before heading off on another adventure with Brittany. I tried, for years, to win their love. To be the good daughter, the one they were proud of. I got good grades, I stayed out of trouble. Not that it mattered, since Brittany's word was law, and I did everything I could to make them notice me. But nothing was ever enough. Brittany could get a B on a test, and it was, "Wow, sweetheart, we're so proud of you." I could get an A+, and it was, "Well, that's what we expect from you." I think the worst part of it all was how much they made me doubt myself. For a long time, I wondered if maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was a bad kid. Maybe I was selfish, difficult, unworthy. And that's the thing about growing up in a house like that, it messes with your head. It makes you believe that love is something you have to earn, that you have to be perfect just to be noticed. And when you still don't get it, you start to wonder if you ever will. By the time I hit my teenage years, the favoritism in my family wasn't just obvious, it was suffocating. Brittany had always been the center of my parents' world, but as we got older, something changed. See, when we were little, she was the golden child, but that only worked because she still had people who liked her. Teachers doted on her, my parents adored her, and she always had friends who followed her around, eager to be part of whatever she was doing. But middle school and high school were different. People started seeing her for who she really was. Brittany had a temper. She always had, but it got worse as we got older. If things didn't go her way, she lashed out. At first, it was just tantrums and crying, but then it became full-on screaming matches, throwing things, and treating people like they were beneath her. And eventually, people got tired of it. By the time she was 15, most of her friends had drifted away. One by one, they stopped coming over, stopped inviting her to things, stopped answering her calls. And Brittany, being Brittany, blamed everyone but herself. That was when things got worse for me. Because if Brittany was miserable, I had to be miserable too. She started taking everything out on me. If she was in a bad mood, I was her target. If I was doing my homework at the kitchen table, she'd come by and shove my books onto the floor just to watch me scramble to pick them up. If I got a new shirt that I liked, she'd find a way to ruin it, spilling something on it, by accident, or stretching it out when I wasn't looking. It was endless. And the worst part? My parents never stopped her. In fact, they made it worse. They decided that if Brittany didn't have friends, I shouldn't either. I remember coming home from school one day, excited because my friend Emily had invited me to a sleepover. I had barely finished asking my mom when she cut me off with a sharp no. When I asked why, she gave me this cold look and said, "Brittany doesn't get to go to sleepovers, so you don't either." It wouldn't be fair. Like anything in my life had ever been fair. That was just the beginning. Slowly, they started cutting me off from everyone. I wasn't allowed to go to birthday parties. I wasn't allowed to join any after-school clubs. If a friend called the house, my mom would answer and tell them I was busy before hanging up. I started noticing how my classmates stopped trying after a while, how the invitations stopped coming, how people started seeing me as the girl who never comes to anything. I wasn't just alone at home, I was alone everywhere. The only people who didn't give up on me were my cousins. My mom's family had a big extended group, and every few months we'd have some kind of gathering, barbecues in the summer, Christmas dinners, birthday parties. It was the only time I felt even a little normal. My cousins, especially my older ones, were like the siblings I wished I had. They actually listened to me, laughed with me, and treated me like I mattered. I don't think my parents realized how much those family gatherings saved me. If they had, they probably would have stopped letting me go. One of those gatherings changed everything. I was 14, and we were at a big family event at my aunt's house. I remember sitting on the back porch with my cousins, talking and joking around, when someone mentioned hanging out the next weekend. It was just a casual comment, something like, "We should all go to the mall next Saturday." Without thinking, I laughed and said, "I wish. I'm not allowed to have friends." The second the words left my mouth, I knew I had messed up. Everyone went quiet. My cousin Jason, who was in college at the time, raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean you're not allowed?" I froze. I hadn't meant to say it out loud, but now they were all staring at me, waiting for an answer. So I told the truth. "My parents don't let me hang out with people," I said, keeping my voice low. "Because Brittany doesn't have friends, and they think it's unfair if I do." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Then, my cousin Melissa, who had always been the blunt one, exploded. "That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Are you serious?" I tried to backtrack, but it was too late. They were furious. They started asking questions, demanding details, and before I knew it, my aunt overheard. And then my uncle. And then, within minutes, half the adults at the party were talking about it. A scene erupted. My aunt cornered my mom in the kitchen, her voice sharp with anger. "Is this true? You're punishing Allison because Brittany can't keep friends." My mom stammered, but my uncle jumped in. "That's not parenting, Linda. That's cruelty." For the first time in my life, I watched as my parents were the ones being scolded. My mom was flustered, my dad was angry, but they couldn't deny it. Too many people had heard me. Too many people were demanding answers. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt like I had won, like someone had finally stood up for me. Instead, all I felt was dread. Because I knew what was waiting for me when we got home. The car ride was silent. My mom's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my dad's jaw was clenched, and Brittany was smirking in the back seat, enjoying every second of it. The second we stepped inside, my mom turned on me, her voice sharp and venomous. "You embarrassed us. Do you have any idea what you just did?" I opened my mouth to defend myself, but she wasn't interested in what I had to say. "You want to act like a victim? Fine. But you're not leaving this house for the next 2 months. House arrest. 2 months. No exceptions." I had expected punishment. I just hadn't expected it to be that bad. For the next 2 months, my world shrank even smaller. No cousins, no gatherings, no leaving the house for anything but school. My parents barely spoke to me, except when they were reminding me how I had humiliated them. Brittany, on the other hand, was having the time of her life. She taunted me constantly, making sure I knew that I had only made things worse for myself. But in the end, something changed. Maybe my parents were afraid of another scene at the next family gathering. Maybe they realized how ridiculous they had been. Whatever the reason, when my punishment was finally over, things weren't exactly the same. I still wasn't allowed to have a normal social life, but they eased up just a little. I was allowed to sit with my cousins at events without being watched like a hawk. My mom stopped intercepting phone calls. My dad actually let me go to one birthday party. It wasn't much, but for me it was everything. By the time I turned 17, I had learned a lot about how my family worked. I knew Brittany would always come first. I knew my parents would never believe me over her. I knew that no matter what I did, I would always be the one at fault. But I had also learned something else. If I wanted to have any kind of life outside of my family, I had to be careful. I had to keep things to myself. That worked for a while, until I got my first boyfriend. His name was Jake. He was kind, funny, and, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had someone who actually saw me. He made me feel special, like I mattered, and after spending years being ignored or treated like an afterthought, that meant everything to me. I made the mistake of telling my parents about him. At first, they acted normal. They wanted to know where he lived, what his parents did, and how we met. Then, the rules came. If I wanted to date him, I had to bring him to the house. I wasn't allowed to go out with him alone. If he wanted to see me, he had to do it under their roof, where they could keep an eye on him. I knew I should have pushed back, but I was young, and I wanted to believe they were just being overprotective. So I agreed. The first time Jake came over, everything seemed fine. My mom was overly polite, my dad was stiff but civil, and Brittany was Brittany. She spent the whole evening watching us, smiling too much, laughing too loudly at his jokes, flipping her hair like she was in some movie. It was obvious, but I ignored it. I told myself she was just being annoying, that she was just trying to get under my skin like she always did. Then, she started finding excuses to be alone with him. If I got up to grab something from the kitchen, she was suddenly there, asking him questions, touching his arm, acting like they were the only ones in the room. If I went to the bathroom, she'd corner him, pressing close, smiling in that way she did when she wanted something. At first, Jake just laughed it off. "Your sister's a little intense," he told me once, shaking his head. But then, he started getting uncomfortable. "She keeps trying to get me alone," he admitted one night after dropping me off. "It's weird." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew. Then, one day, everything exploded. Jake came over like usual, and at some point, I ran upstairs to grab my phone charger. I was gone for maybe 2 minutes. When I came back down, Brittany was sitting way too close to him, her hand on his knee. He looked uncomfortable, tense, like he was trying to figure out how to get away without making a scene. The second she saw me, she jerked her hand back and smiled. I felt sick. That night, Jake told me everything. "She keeps saying stuff," he admitted. "Like, if I ever get bored of you, she's available." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. But I didn't. I just told him to ignore her, that she was just doing it to mess with me. And for a while, that was the plan. Then, Brittany changed her approach. When Jake came over the next time, my parents called me into the kitchen for some nonsense excuse. Something about setting the table or checking on dinner. I was only gone for a couple of minutes, but that was all she needed. By the time I walked back in, Jake was standing stiffly by the couch, looking furious, while Brittany sat there with a smug little smile. That night, my parents pulled me aside. Their expressions were grave, serious. My dad crossed his arms, my mom sighed like this was something painful for her. And then they said it. "Brittany told us what happened," my mom said softly. Jake put his hands on her. My stomach dropped. I looked at Brittany, who was sitting on the couch, head down, playing the part of the innocent victim. I looked at Jake, who was standing there in shock, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "That's not true," I said, my voice shaking. "He would never." My dad cut me off. "Enough. We will not have you dating someone like that. You are not to see him again." I turned to Jake, my chest tightening. "Tell them," I begged. "I didn't touch her," he said firmly. "She came on to me." My mother gasped like he had just cursed at her. "How dare you say that about your girlfriend's sister?" I looked at Brittany, waiting for her to break, to laugh, to smirk, to do anything that showed she was lying. But she didn't. She just sat there, playing the role of the victim perfectly. And just like that, Jake was gone. My parents forbade me from speaking to him again. They took my phone at night to make sure I wasn't texting him. They checked my emails. They made sure I was never alone long enough to even try to contact him. Eventually, Jake stopped trying. I was devastated. But it didn't end there. A year later, I started dating someone new. His name was Ryan. He was sweet, patient, the kind of guy who actually listened when I talked. I kept him a secret for as long as I could, but eventually, my parents found out. And just like before, they laid down the rules. If I wanted to see him, it had to be under their roof. If I wanted to date him, they had to approve. I should have known what would happen. I should have learned my lesson. But part of me wanted to believe it had been a one-time thing. That maybe, just maybe, Brittany had changed. She hadn't. The first time he came over, she started again. The flirting, the touching, the little smirks whenever I got upset. But Ryan, just like Jake, wasn't interested. He brushed her off, ignored her, made it clear he was with me. And just like before, she flipped the story. This time it was even worse. She ran to my parents crying, shaking, telling them that Ryan had grabbed her when no one was looking, that he had tried to force himself on her. My parents didn't even question it. They called me downstairs, sat me down, and told me, once again, that I was dating a disgusting, immoral boy, and that they wouldn't allow it. When I tried to defend him, my mother shook her head, disappointed. "It's so sad," she murmured. "You always side with strangers over your own family." And that was it. Another relationship destroyed. That was the moment I decided I was done. I promised myself that from that point on, I would never introduce another boyfriend to my family. They didn't deserve to be part of that part of my life. They didn't get to have a say. If I wanted to have a future, if I wanted to find love, I had to do it without them. And I did. By the time college became a topic of conversation in our house, I already knew how this was going to go. I knew Brittany would get whatever she wanted, and I would be left to fend for myself. It had always been that way, and there was no reason to believe this would be any different. Brittany barely made it through high school. She was never a good student, never cared about her grades, and never put in any effort. But my parents never seemed to mind. They made excuses for her, blamed the teachers, and acted like the world was out to get her. When she barely scraped by with average grades, they treated it like a victory. When she got rejection after rejection from decent universities, they just shrugged and said, "Not every school values personality over test scores." Eventually, she got into a not-so-great university, one that didn't require much to get in. No scholarships, no grants, nothing to help with tuition. Just an acceptance letter and a price tag of $80,000 a year. My parents didn't hesitate. "We'll cover it," my dad said, waving a hand like it was no big deal. "We'll take care of everything." $80,000 a year. And they paid it without question, without complaint, without so much as a conversation about how much it would cost in the long run. I sat there, listening, watching as they celebrated Brittany's big achievement. I didn't say anything, but I already knew what was coming when it was my turn. I had always been the better student. I worked hard, got good grades, joined clubs, did everything right, but that had never mattered in my family. I wasn't Brittany, which meant I wasn't special. Still, when the time came to talk about my future, I brought it up. I sat my parents down, told them I had been looking at colleges, and asked what the plan was. My mom sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Allison, we just don't have that kind of money. College is expensive." I felt a familiar anger creep up my spine, but I kept my face neutral. "You're paying for Brittany." "That's different," my dad said quickly, like he had been waiting for me to say something. "Brittany needs our help. You're more independent." In other words, Brittany deserved to have her future handed to her, and I was supposed to figure mine out alone. But they didn't know that I had seen this coming. I had spent years preparing for this moment, making sure I wouldn't need anything from them. I had applied for every scholarship, every grant, anything that would keep me from being financially tied to them. I knew they would never support me, so I had made sure I wouldn't need their support. And it worked. I had received a full scholarship to a university with a tuition cost of $40,000 a year. Everything, tuition, housing, books, completely covered. I could have told my parents first. I could have sat them down and broken the news, waited to see if they would be proud of me, waited to see if, for once, they would acknowledge what I had accomplished. But I didn't, because I knew them too well. If I told them in private, they would find a way to sabotage it. They would guilt me, make me feel selfish, maybe even try to stop me from going altogether. So I posted it on social media instead. A long, heartfelt post about how hard I had worked, how grateful I was for the scholarship, how excited I was for this next step in my life. Within minutes, the comments started rolling in, family members congratulating me, old teachers telling me how proud they were, distant relatives talking about how incredible it was that I had earned this opportunity on my own. By the time my parents saw it, it was too late. The entire family knew. They couldn't take it back. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't stop it. They were forced to act like they were happy for me. And for the first time in my life, I had won. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I had built a life for myself that had nothing to do with my family. I had a good job, a place of my own, and, most importantly, I had learned how to keep them at arm's length. Years of being overlooked, manipulated, and thrown aside had taught me that the only way to survive was to stop expecting anything from them. So I didn't. I never asked for help, never let them too deep into my personal life, and never, under any circumstances, introduced them to the people I dated. Then I met Nick. Nick was unlike anyone I had ever been with before. He was sharp, confident, and had this way of seeing through people that made it impossible for them to hide who they really were. He had a natural talent for exposing manipulators, and the first time he met my family, he saw right through them. It took him less than 5 minutes to understand exactly what I had been dealing with my entire life. It was the first time I had ever dated someone who actually understood what I was up against. When we got engaged, I knew what was coming. My parents would find a way to make it about Brittany. They always did. I had prepared myself for it, but even I wasn't ready for how ridiculous they would be this time. At first, everything seemed normal. My mom and dad acted excited when I told them the news, congratulated me, and even offered to help with the wedding. It was one of the few times in my life that they actually acted like parents. But that was before they got to the conditions. "We'll cover the wedding," my dad said with a smile, "but only if Brittany walks down the aisle first." I blinked. "What? You know how hard it's been for her," my mom chimed in, her tone dripping with fake concern. "She's older, and it would be humiliating for her if you got married before she did. She should be the one to walk down the aisle first." I stared at them, unable to believe what I was hearing. They weren't just asking me to wait. They were asking me to plan my wedding around Brittany's timeline, as if my engagement didn't even matter. "Oh," my mom added, as if it were an afterthought, "and of course she'll need a proper wedding. A beautiful ceremony, a designer dress, and a cake that reflects her taste. Something elegant, something fitting. We were thinking at least a $2,000 cake." I looked at Nick, expecting him to be furious, but instead, I saw something else in his expression: amusement. He wasn't angry. He was intrigued. Later, when we were alone, I asked him why he hadn't immediately shut them down. He smirked and said, "Because they're trying to play a game. So let's play one too." Nick's plan was simple. We would pretend to agree. We would act like we were considering their offer, let them think they had won, and then, when they least expected it, we would flip the script. "They think they're in control," he told me. "Let's make them think that for a little while longer." For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reacting to their manipulation. I was playing the game right back at them. And with Nick by my side, I knew that, for once, I wouldn't be the one left broken at the end of it. 4 months, my parents and Brittany believed everything was going according to their plan. They thought they had won, that Nick and I had rolled over and accepted their conditions. They were convinced that Brittany would walk down the aisle first, in her wedding dress, with her extravagant $2,000 cake waiting for her. Nick and I let them believe it. We smiled through the phone calls, nodded along when my mother talked about Brittany's big day, and never once hinted at what was really happening. We played the part perfectly, pretending to be grateful, pretending to go along with their ridiculous demands, all while making our own arrangements in secret. The truth was, we had never intended to let them take over our wedding. 2 days before the ceremony, we hired 2 professional security guards at $500 per hour. Their instructions were simple: Brittany was not to be allowed inside. If she tried to push her way in, if she caused a scene, if she so much as attempted to play the victim, they were to hold their ground and keep her out. The day of the wedding arrived, and everything was perfect. The venue was breathtaking, the guests were excited, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. I stood at the back, waiting for my cue to walk down the aisle, my heart pounding in anticipation, not just for the ceremony, but for what was about to unfold. Right on schedule, Brittany showed up, expecting to be the star of the show. She was dressed in a full bridal gown, veil and all, walking with the confidence of someone who thought the world revolved around her. But before she could take a single step inside, the guards stopped her. She blinked, confused, and then realization dawned on her face. "What do you mean I can't go in?" she shrieked. "This is my wedding." The guards didn't budge. Meanwhile, inside, the ceremony had started. The music played, and I stepped forward, but before I could even reach the altar, my dad suddenly got up from his seat. He had heard the commotion outside, and without hesitation, he abandoned me in front of everyone and rushed toward the door to find out what was happening. The guests looked around, murmuring in confusion. Whispers started spreading. People turned in their seats, craning their necks to see what was going on. Then, right on cue, one of my friends, playing her part perfectly, gasped and said just loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Wait, her dad said she wasn't supposed to be the bride?" The words hung in the air for a split second before chaos erupted. The guests started asking questions all at once, voices overlapping. Some got up from their seats, some turned toward my mother, demanding answers. Others started making their way toward the entrance, drawn in by the scene that was now unfolding outside. My father was yelling, Brittany was sobbing, my mother was frantically trying to do damage control, and all around them, our family and friends watched in stunned disbelief. Nick stood beside me, calm as ever, leaning in slightly to whisper, "Checkmate." I smiled. If there was one thing I had learned about Brittany over the years, it was that when she didn't get her way, she didn't just get upset, she completely lost control. And that was exactly what happened outside my wedding venue. Brittany, still dressed in her $5,000 wedding gown, collapsed onto the asphalt like a toddler denied a toy. She sobbed loudly, her perfectly styled hair unraveling, her makeup running in streaks down her face. It wasn't just crying, it was full-on wailing, the kind that made heads turn and guests whisper to each other in shock. "This isn't fair," she screeched, pounding her fists against the pavement. "This was supposed to be my day." Meanwhile, my parents were scrambling. They knew this was a disaster, knew that people were watching, knew that they had been caught in their own ridiculous game. And when people like them get caught, they don't take responsibility, they look for someone else to blame. So, naturally, they turned on Nick. My mother, still trying to save face, stormed up to him with an accusatory glare. "You planned this, didn't you?" she hissed. "You manipulated Allison into this cruel stunt." Nick, ever the master of strategy, gasped in mock horror. He placed a hand over his chest, looking deeply offended. "What? Me? I would never agree to such savagery. That's absolutely terrible." He turned toward the crowd, shaking his head. "Where is the proof of such an accusation?" That was the genius of it. We had made sure that everything was arranged without a single written agreement, without a single text or email confirming our real plan. Every conversation about our supposed agreement to let Brittany have her moment had been in person, always making sure my parents never had anything to use against us later. And now, when they needed proof, there was none. The guests, already murmuring amongst themselves, started looking at my parents with suspicion. If they had truly planned something with Nick, why wasn't there any proof? Why wasn't there a single shred of evidence? My father, furious and humiliated, wasn't having it. He had always been the one in control, always been the one who could bend reality to fit his version of events. But not this time. This time, there was nothing he could do to turn the situation back in his favor. So he did what angry, powerless men do, he lashed out. In a sudden burst of rage, he lunged at Nick, his face twisted in fury. "You little..." But he never got the chance to finish. Before he could even get close, the security guards stepped in, their hands up in warning, their presence enough to make him hesitate. At the same time, several guests, including some of my cousins, instinctively moved to block his path. "Calm down, Tom," someone muttered. "This is embarrassing." "Enough," another guest added. "You're making a fool of yourself." It was over. There, in front of the entire wedding party, in front of every family member, every friend, every witness who mattered, my father stood frozen, humiliated, seething with anger but completely and utterly powerless. Nick, ever composed, straightened his tie and gave him the slightest, most infuriating smirk. And I, for the first time in my life, stood tall, knowing that they had lost. After all the chaos, the wedding went on exactly as planned, without my parents and without Brittany. The air felt lighter without them there, like the whole event had been purified of their toxicity. The guests, still buzzing from the spectacle outside, were especially warm toward me, making it clear that they were on my side. People who had barely spoken to me before were suddenly offering kind words, hugs, and reassurances that I had done the right thing. It was the first time in my life I had felt truly supported by my own family. And the best part? The celebration itself was extravagant, elegant, and expensive, all paid for by the same manipulative relatives who had originally planned on funding Brittany's fake wedding moment. Since they had already set aside money for a wedding, they had no choice but to funnel it toward mine. It was almost poetic. Every bite of food, every sip of champagne, every breathtaking decoration was funded by the very people who had tried to take this day away from me. Nick and I enjoyed every second of it. We danced, we laughed, and we soaked in the victory that tasted even sweeter because we had won on our own terms. But, of course, my parents and Brittany didn't stay quiet for long. Less than 24 hours after the wedding, they started reaching out. First, it was the expected rage. Furious messages, missed calls, long-winded voicemails filled with accusations and threats. Then came the guilt-tripping, the manipulative sob stories, the desperate attempts to twist the narrative. My mother sent messages about how humiliated she had been, my father demanded that I apologize for ruining the family name, and Brittany, predictably, made it all about herself. Nick, ever the strategist, didn't just ignore them, he played his own game. Instead of responding, he collected every single insult, every manipulative text, every voicemail laced with venom. Then, with one simple action, he dropped them all into the family group chat. No explanations, no comments, just their own words, fully exposed for everyone to see. The reaction was immediate. Relatives who had still been on the fence about what had happened could now see the truth in plain text. My parents' dramatic pleas and Brittany's self-absorbed rants laid everything bare. One by one, people started turning against them. The messages that had once been filled with demands for me to make amends shifted into silence. No one supported them. No one came rushing to their defense. Brittany, the girl who had always been the center of attention, was suddenly left in complete isolation. And Nick, watching it all unfold, just sighed and jokingly said, "I wish Brittany hadn't broken the ban. I would have humiliated her in public again." And with that, I knew I had truly won.